Brothers and sisters, peace be with you. Thank God it's time to read Bible. Let's continue to read Genesis chapter 12. We will start from verse 7 today. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord, who had appeared to him. Shechem was Abram's first stop after he entered Canaan. At Shechem, he experienced God was his shoulder and whom he could depend on. Under the tree of Moreh, he learned to know God's will, and God's leading. This should be the first experience for each Christian as they follow God, to know that God is faithful and reliable. God is the God whom you can entrust your life to. You can only learn from God, and because you learn, God's promise to you will move one step forward. To Abram's offspring, he will give the land. Because of God's promise, Abram built an altar there to the Lord. When Abram was still in Ur of Chaldeans, which was next to Shechem, people living in Shechem was like people in the world today. Their lives were lives of building cities and towers. Building the cities was to make sure that life was secure. Building towers was to make a name for themselves. Before we were saved by grace, we lived in this world. These two were things we went after. We need our lives to be stable and secure. This is the principle of building the city. It's not only to meet our individual needs, but also to make a name for ourselves so we could become someone people respect and look up to. That's why we build towers. One tower after another to show the glory of man. But Abram's life total change after he entered into Canaan. He lived a life of tent and altar. He lived in the tent. It tells that he was a foreigner and pilgrim on the earth. Whenever God called him, he would follow God's calling and set out right away. This was his attitude towards the world. He lived a life of exile, but to God, he was someone who built the altar. He gave his whole life to God to praise his name. It's not important whether he himself was great or not, and whether people remember him or not. Offering sacrifice is to offer ourselves to the altar. We are burned into ashes by the heavenly fire, and it produces a pleasing aroma, reaching up to the heaven to please God. He experienced God's faithfulness and reliability. He offered to God the first offering in his life. That was, he offered himself to God. What is offering? We experience God's love. We know that God paid a big price to redeem us back to him, so we should belong to God. This is the essence of offering. But in the experience of offering, there are 6 different stages. One is higher than the other. First is the change of sovereignty. We used to be in control of ourselves. Once we offer ourselves, we give out our sovereignty so God can be in control in our life. The first step of offering is that you realize the change of sovereignty. The second step of offering is the change of status. You were a free person in the past. Wherever you want to go, you go. With the change of sovereignty, it brought the second step, which is the change of status. Now you are a servant of God. A servant doesn't have freedom. A servant should follow master's command and act. After you offer yourselves, your status will change. You become a servant of God. After the change of status, it brings the third change of existence. You no longer live for yourself, you live for God. This is the change of existence. Because you live for God and God is eternal, so you look up eternal things, and God is spiritual, so you go after spiritual things. God is life, so you're willing to receive the supply of life from God every day. Because you exist for God, you become someone who excels. Things that the world go after, such as fame, fortune, and status, will no longer bother you. You live for God. With the change of existence, it brings the fourth change of goal. God's goal is your goal. In order to reach God's goal, you have a lot of burden because your goal is to want more of God and help saints around you to want more of God. So you have burden for other people. Because of the change of your goal, it brings the fifth change of your labor. Things you do and your ministry are all abound to Christ in life. So change of your labor will bring the sixth change, your inward change and change of your composition. What is the change of composition? That is, your character will reveal Christ's virtue on you. When people get close to you, they will feel that you are full of the pleasing aroma of Christ. Of course, offering is a lifelong journey for each Christian. We should move forward step by step, just like Abraham's experience in Canaan. He had the first altar in his life in Shechem. He experienced his dependence on God. God was a mighty shoulder. Verse 8. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. God led him to move forward after the experience of Shechem. He arrived in a new place in between Bethel and Ai. Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. Bethel is the house of God. Ai is Hip's ruin. This is a special experience. God leads us. After we experience God's faithfulness, we learn how to depend on God in all things. God then leads us to the second step, His will. God's will has always been in His house, which is the church today. When we start to follow God, it seems that we arrive in Bethel, arrive in God's house. Actually, in most of our experience, we are usually in between Bethel and Ai. Ai is heaps of ruins. For each person who follows God, the world is heaps of ruins. After we left Shechem, we arrived in between Bethel and Ai. We are in between church and world. When we look towards west, it's church. It is glorious, it's life, and it is abundance. So church is in the west. When we look towards east, it's Ai, which is the world. This world often attracts us, wave their hands, and ask us to go back to the world. But we realize in our heart that there was just heaps of ruins there. Although it gave you temporary enjoyment and satisfaction, at the end it will become desolate. Though we recognize this in our knowledge because we have gone through the Morag at Shechem, in our experience, we often stay in between the world and the church. On one hand, you want to follow God and you would like to enjoy God's abundance and provisions in church. But on the other hand, the world continues to attract you. It's not stable in this situation, but it is a path that each person who followed God would walk through. At that place, Abraham built a second altar. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Offering is our lifelong lesson. Every time God leads us to walk one step more, we should have a new offering to God based on our knowledge at the time. Abraham has gone through Shechem and knew God's faithfulness and reliability. God led him to walk the next step. God's faithfulness and reliability is not just for Abraham. It's also for the whole church, and it's for God's house. With this new knowledge, Abraham had a renewed offering, and he called on the name of the Lord there. Calling on the name of the Lord is to pray to God, ask for God's help and provision. In a lot of situations, we know in our knowledge, but we can't follow in our experience. We need God's help. We call on the name of the Lord. The second altar was built in between Bethel and Ai. There is attraction of church life on one side and the attraction of the world on the other. We fell in struggling all the time. If there is new provision and words from God today, I walk to the west and enjoy the abundance and beautiful church life. Tomorrow, I have some hardship and my prayers are not answered. We get close to the east side and walk to the war. Many Christians constantly live in this type of struggle after they are saved. We are tired after we struggle for a long time. This is also Abraham's experience. Verse 9. Then Abraham set out and continued towards the Negev. South of Canaan is Egypt, which represents the war. Because we don't have new supply from God every day, unconsciously we set out and continue towards the south. This is Abraham's experience. It's also experience of each Christian in the journey to heaven. But thank God, God is faithful. God will lead us through different circumstances so we can learn the lesson of offering at the end. In the midst of it, we will have weakness, we will have failure, but as we turn back, we have a better experience in offering to God. As we fellowship before, the offering of each Christian has to go through change of sovereignty, change of status, change of existence, change of goal, change of labor, and at the end, change of inward. What we should grasp is that we have real offering to God at each stage. We can build altar to at each step that God lead us through. Let's pray. God, may Abraham's experience become our experience. Help us to experience that you are faithful, God, and you will be the one we can depend on in our life. In our life today, help us to know that you provide for us, and you will also lead us to a rich church life. Although the world will disturb us, we ask that you help us to offer ourselves to become sacrifice. You remember this offering. Bless my life. Pray in Jesus' name.